Winter, 1879 inside the abandoned Blackwood train station. High in the snowbound Wyoming mountains, the door burst apart beneath a gunshot, and Clara staggered backward, clutching the rifle as two bounty hunters stormed through the blizzard. "Hand her over, Cordova," one man shouted. "She's worth $500. Jace stepped in front of her, his jaw clenched and his revolver raised. "Then, you'll have to come through me." When the shooting finally stopped, Clara stood frozen beside the stove, tears sliding silently over the scars covering her face. Jace gently lowered the rifle from her trembling hands. "You re with me now." But could one cowboy protect her from the powerful husband who had already sent more men after them? Stay with us, subscribe, and discover how Clara's fight for justice truly began. The blizzard hit without mercy. It came down from the mountains like God had decided to bury everything and start over. Wind screamed through the valley, bending the pines sideways, packing snow into every crack and hollow it could find. By nightfall, the old Blackwood train station was nothing but a dark shape in the white abandoned, half-rotted, forgotten by the railroad company 3 years back, and by everyone else shortly after. Clara Sterling found it by accident, or maybe by grace. She wasn't sure there was a difference anymore. She pushed through the broken door sideways, her whole body leaning into the wind. Inside, the cold was still brutal, but at least the walls killed the worst of it. She stood there for a moment, breathing hard, her fingers so numb she could barely feel the tin box she was holding. She pressed it against her chest anyway, and kept moving. The far corner still had part of its roof. She dragged herself to it, lowered herself to the floor, and pulled her wool shawl tighter around her face. Her boots were soaked through. Her back ached from 3 days of running through scrub brush, through creek beds, through stretches of open plain where every shadow looked like a man on horseback. She set the tin box in her lap and rested both hands on top of it. Outside, the blizzard howled. Clara closed her eyes and told herself she wasn't going to cry again. She'd done enough of that. Crying didn't feed you. Crying didn't keep you warm. And crying, sure, didn't change what Josiah had done. She sat there in the dark, very still, and listened to the storm. She almost didn't hear the horse. The sound cut through the wind hoofbeats, slow and deliberate, coming from the south. Clara's eyes snapped open. She pulled the shawl tighter and shrank back against the wall, wedging herself into the shadow. Her heart was hammering. She counted. 1 rider. Just 1. That was something. At least. The horse stopped outside. A moment of silence. Then the door groaned open. He filled the frame completely. Tall, heavy coat, snow caked across his shoulders and the brim of his hat. He stepped inside and shook himself like a man who'd been riding through that weather for hours and had stopped being angry about it. Somewhere around mile 40, he pulled his hat off, knocked the snow loose, and let his eyes adjust to the dark. He saw her almost immediately. Clara didn't move. She sat perfectly still, the shawl covering everything below her eyes. The tin box pressed hard to her chest. The man didn't reach for his gun. He just looked at her for a moment, his face unreadable. Then he said, "You picked the worst corner in the whole building." His voice was low and flat, like he was making an observation rather than a complaint. "Wind comes straight through that wall. I can see the gaps from here." Clara said nothing. He glanced around the station, taking stock of the place, the way a man does when he's thinking about survival and nothing else. He found an old iron stove near the center of the room, half buried under a collapsed bench. He walked over, pulled the bench aside, and crouched down to check the flue. "Stove still works," he said. "I've got wood on the horse. Stay or go. That's your business. But I'm building a fire." He went back out into the blizzard without another word. Clara watched the door. She thought about running. She'd been thinking about running for 3 days straight. It was practically the only thought she had left. But her feet weren't going to carry her back out into that storm. She knew that. Her body had made the decision, even if her mind hadn't. He came back in with an armload of split wood and a saddlebag over one shoulder. He built the fire with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times in worse conditions than this. He didn't talk. He didn't look at her. He just worked. When the fire caught, the warmth spread across the floorboards slowly, like something cautious. Clara let herself lean toward it just slightly. "Jace Cordova," the man said, not looking up. He was feeding a second piece of wood into the stove. In case you were wondering, she didn't offer her name back. He didn't seem to expect one. He stood, brushed the sawdust off his coat, and moved to the other side of the fire. He sat down on an overturned crate, pulled off his gloves, and held his hands near the heat. He was quiet. That surprised her. Most men who tried to seem harmless talked too much. This one just sat there and let the fire speak for itself. Clara watched him from the shadow of her shawl. His face was weathered, lined around the eyes in a way that came from squinting into too much sun and too much wind. There was a scar along his jaw, old and pale. His coat was good quality, once she could tell by the cut, but it had been through enough hard winters that it didn't look like much anymore. He wore his gun low on his hip, the way men wore them, when they expected to use it and wanted the draw to be easy. He turned toward the fire and reached into his coat. Clara tensed, but he only pulled out a folded piece of paper. He looked at it for a moment, expression flat, giving nothing away. Then he turned his back to her, leaning toward the firelight as if he needed the glow to read by. She couldn't see what it was. She couldn't see the rough sketch of a woman's face printed at the top. Couldn't see the bold black letters below it. Couldn't see the 500 figure at the bottom, or the name signed underneath in a preacher's clean, careful hand. Jace stared at the wanted poster. Then he folded it and put it back in his pocket. He turned around, stretched his legs out toward the fire, and pulled his hat down over his eyes. "Get some sleep," he said. "Storm will break by morning." The fire burned low by midnight. Jace woke up the way he always woke up all at once, eyes open, hand already near his gun before his brain had fully caught up. Old habit. The kind you pick up when sleeping too deep gets you killed. He lay still for a moment and listened. Wind, snow battering the walls, the stove ticking as the metal cooled, and something else, a sound he couldn't place at first. He sat up. Clara was shivering. She was still in the same corner where he'd found her, curled on her side with the tin box pulled against her stomach, her shawl wrapped twice around her shoulders. But even from across the room, he could see her trembling. Her breathing was shallow and too fast. When he got closer, he could see sweat on her forehead despite the cold. Fever. He crouched beside her and pressed the back of his hand to her cheek without thinking, then stopped himself. She flinched even in sleep, her whole body pulled inward at the touch. He pulled his hand back and studied her face. The shawl had slipped, just a few inches, just enough. The left side of her face was a ruin of scarred tissue, raised and puckered and pulled tight in the way that only a severe burn leaves. It started at the edge of her jaw and climbed her cheekbone, reaching toward her temple. Her neck was worse. The skin there had healed badly, unevenly, like it had been left to fend for itself. Jay sat back on his heels. He'd seen burns before. He'd seen what happened when gunpowder went wrong, when a stove exploded, when a man got too close to a barn fire. Those were accidents. You could tell the difference if you knew what to look for. Accidents spread in patterns that made sense. They followed the physics of fire and panic. This didn't follow any accident he'd ever seen. These scars had a shape, a deliberate shape, like someone had applied the flame carefully, like someone had taken their time. He stood up, walked back to the fire, and fed it 2 more pieces of wood. The flames climbed again, throwing orange light across the station floor. He pulled his coat from the nail he'd hung it on and stood there for a moment with it in his hands. The wanted poster was in the inside pocket. He could feel it without reaching, for it knew exactly where it sat. Knew the weight of it the way you know. The weight of anything you've been carrying for days. $500. That was real money. That was a new horse, 6 months of supplies, a winter, somewhere warm. That was the difference between scraping and comfortable. And Jace Cordova had been scraping for longer than he cared to admit. He hung the coat back on the nail, He went to his saddlebag and found the small tin of medical supplies he carried, not because he was sentimental, but because being practical about wounds kept you alive. He had a strip of clean cloth, a small bottle of carbolic, and some dried willow bark that he'd traded for in Pueblo 3 months back. He set water to boil in his tin cup, dropped in the willow bark, and waited. When the tea was ready, he crouched beside Clara again and sat there trying to figure out how to wake a fevered, terrified woman without getting himself shot. He settled on setting the cup on the floor in front of her face, close enough that the steam would reach her. And then he sat back and waited. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first. Then they found the cup. Then they found him. She scrambled backward so fast she hit the wall. The tin box clutched to her chest, her free hand scrabbling for something to use as a weapon and finding nothing. Easy, Jace didn't move. You've got a fever. The tea will bring it down. She stared at him. Her eyes were bright with heat and fear, moving from his face to the cup to the room around her, calculating exits, calculating odds. He recognized that look. He'd seen it on cornered animals and on people who'd been hurt badly enough that the two were hard to tell apart. I didn't touch that box, he said. I didn't touch you either, except to check the fever. The tea's just willow bark. It's not going to hurt you. Clara said nothing, but she looked at the cup. You're going to fall over if you don't get something warm in you, he said. That's just fact. A long silence. The fire crackled. She reached out and took the cup. She drank it slow, watching him over the rim. He sat on the far side of the fire and didn't look at her directly, gave her what space he could in a room that didn't offer much. Outside, the blizzard was still howling, going nowhere. How long has the fever been on you? He asked. Couple days, she said. Her voice was rough, like she hadn't used it much. You've been running a couple days with a fever. She didn't answer that. He nodded, like she had. She fell asleep again before the cup was empty. He caught it before it tipped and set it aside, this time when her breathing evened out. It was deeper and slower, the willow bark working. He went back to his side of the fire and sat down. He pulled the wanted poster out of his coat. Clara Sterling, wife of Reverend Josiah Thorne of Oakhaven. Wanted for theft, vandalism, and willful abandonment, believed to be dangerous. $500 reward for return alive and unharmed. He read it twice. Then he read the fine print at the bottom, the part about the issuing party, Reverend Josiah Thorne. The man had filed the poster himself, had paid the printing himself, had written dangerous next to the name of a woman who weighed maybe 120 pounds soaking wet, and had been sleeping in an abandoned train station with a tin box for a pillow. Jace looked at the scar tissue on the left side of her face, visible even from across the room in the firelight. He folded the poster and put it back in his pocket. He didn't sleep again that night. By the second morning, the blizzard had eased to a steady snowfall, and Clara's fever had cracked. She sat up on her own and ate half a portion of the salt pork he offered without being asked twice. Color was coming back into her face, the right side of it. At least, she didn't talk much. He didn't push. He cooked. She ate. He fixed a gap in the south wall with boards from a broken crate. She watched him work. On the second evening, she said, "You were a soldier." He glanced over his shoulder. "What makes you say that?" "The way you move. Always checking the room. Always putting your back to something solid." She paused. "And you build a fire the same way every time. Same order. Same position. Soldiers get trained into routines." "Army surgeon taught me the routine," he said. "Said a consistent fire is a safe fire." "Were you a surgeon?" "No." He fed the last piece of kindling into the stove. "I just listened." She turned the tin box over in her hands. She did that when she was thinking, turned it the same direction, set it down, picked it up again. He'd noticed it on the first night. "Where were you trying to get to?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "County seat. There's a judge there. An honest one. Or so I heard." "Heard from who?" "A woman in Laramie," she said. "Judge Calhoun doesn't belong to anyone." Clara looked up. "I have documents. In here." She touched the lid of the box. "Documents that prove what Josiah has done. To the water rights. To the land deeds. To the families who couldn't pay. Documents can be disputed. Jay said these ones can't. They're in his own hand, signed by him, witnessed by people who are now dead. Her voice was steady. Whatever fear she'd shown on the first night had been packed away somewhere. What was left underneath it was harder. He thinks he burned everything when he burned the ranch house. He forgot about the lockbox I kept buried under the floor of the stable. Jace looked at the tin box. He forget about you too, he asked quietly. Clara's jaw tightened. He thought he had. The silence sat there between them, full and heavy, while the snow fell outside. That night, he moved his bedroll 3 feet closer to the stove and told her it was because the temperature was dropping. She didn't argue. He lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathe. Steady now, even. He reached into his coat. He held the wanted poster over the stove's open grate. Then he folded it back up and put it away again. Not yet. He needed to think. She found it on the 3rd morning. Jace was outside checking on the horse-breaking ice off the water in the feed bucket, clearing snow from the makeshift lean-to he'd built against the station's east wall. He'd been out there maybe 20 minutes. Long enough. When he came back in, Clara was standing in the middle of the room, holding the wanted poster in both hands. His coat was on the floor. She must have knocked it off the nail, reaching for something else. Or maybe she'd been looking deliberately. He didn't know. It didn't matter now. She looked at him. The poster shook slightly in her hands. Her face had gone completely still in the particular way that happens when someone is working very hard to keep everything inside from getting out. He stopped in the doorway, didn't reach for his gun, didn't step forward, just stood there and let her process it. $500, she said. Clara from him. Her voice cracked on that word, just slightly. You knew. The whole time. I knew when I rode in. Yes, she took a step back. Her eyes moved to his Winchester, leaned against the wall 6 feet to her left. Jace watched her calculate it, watched her decide. She moved fast, crossing to it in 3 steps, and by the time he cleared the doorway, she had it up and leveled at his chest. She knew how to hold a rifle. That was the first thing he noticed. Her grip was correct. Her elbow was right. She'd been taught by someone who knew what they were doing. You were going to turn me in, she said. I hadn't decided yet. That's not a no. No, he said. It's not. The fire was burning. The room smelled like wood smoke and wet wool and cold air rushing in through the still open door behind him. Jay stood completely still and let her hold the gun. Because the truth was, he'd been carrying that poster for 3 days, and she'd earned the right to point something at him. How much money do you need? She asked. The question came out raw and honest. What is it you need so badly that you'd take $500 from a man like him? He didn't answer right away. He looked at her standing there, her face uncovered in the firelight, the scars visible, the rifle steady, and he said, My brother owes a debt in Cheyenne to men who'll collect it one way or another. I've been trying to get ahead of it for 2 years. So your brother's life is worth more than mine. I hadn't decided yet, he said again. That's the truth. I've been carrying that paper, and I hadn't made up my mind. Why? He looked at her scars. She saw him look, and her chin came up not with shame, but with the hard-edged dignity of someone who had long since stopped apologizing for what had been done to them. Because of those, he said quietly. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then the door behind him exploded off its hinges. The impact sent Jace sideways into the wall. Wood splintered everywhere. Snow and frozen air flooded the room. He got his footing back. Just as the first shot rang out, it went wide, punching through the station walls 6 inches to his right. And he was already moving before the sound finished echoing. 2 men. He clocked them in the first half-second. Big coats, the kind bought for hard work in bad weather. One by the door, one coming through the window. To the right, he'd kicked the board out and was climbing through with a pistol in his hand, both of them grinning. The grin of men who'd been tracking something for days and were pleased to have finally run it down. Cordova, the one by the door, had a voice like gravel. Thorne hired us on too. Thought he'd double his odds. He spread his hands. Better deal for everyone you hand over the woman, and we split the 500 3 ways. That math doesn't work, Jace said. Sure it does. Third of 500 beats none of 500. The man tilted his head. Walk away. Cordova, she's just a bounty. Jace glanced at Clara. She was behind the stove, still holding the Winchester, pressed flat against the wall. Their eyes met. He turned back to the man in the door. No, Jace said. It happened fast. The man by the window moved first. Jace heard it before he saw it, the shift of weight on the sill. And he dropped low and drew in the same motion. The shot from the window punched through the space where his head had been a half-second before. Jace fired twice. The man dropped. The one by the door was shooting now, advancing, using the doorframe for cover. And Jace scrambled behind the overturned crate, a bullet clipping the wood 2 inches from his shoulder. He heard the Winchester go off to his left once, sharp and clean, and the man in the doorway lurched sideways. Not hit solid, but enough. Jace came up from behind the crate and finished it. The gunshots stopped. The wind filled the silence. Snow drifted in through the broken door and the open window, settling on the floorboards, covering the wreckage. Jace stood in the middle of the room. His ears were ringing. He looked at his hands steady, which surprised him less than it probably should have. He looked at the 2 men on the floor, checked them both, and then stood up straight. Clara was still against the wall. The Winchester was still in her hands. She was shaking. It started in her hands and worked its way through her whole body. And the tears came without any warning at all. They just appeared on her face and tracked down across her scars. And she made no sound, just stood there shaking, the rifle still aimed at the space where the men had been. Jace walked across the room slowly. He stopped in front of her. He looked at the rifle, then at her face, the tears, and the firelight, and the scars all together. Her eyes fixed somewhere past him, at something he couldn't see. He reached out and put one hand on the barrel of the Winchester, gently, just enough pressure that she could feel it. Put the gun down. Clara, he said. His voice was quiet. The storm was loud outside. You're with me now. She looked at him. For a long moment, she held the rifle and looked at him, and he could see her deciding again the same calculation she'd been running since the first night, trying to measure how much a man's word was worth, and coming up short every time. Then she lowered the rifle. He took it from her hands and set it against the wall. She was still shaking. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him if she leaned an inch in either direction, and he waited. And after a while, the shaking slowed. There'll be more, she said. He always sends more, I know. So what do we do? Jace looked at the tin box on the floor, exactly where she'd set it down when she reached for the rifle. He looked at the wanted poster, crumpled now, lying in the dirt near his coat. He picked up the poster. He walked to the stove and dropped it in through the open grate. They both watched it burn. We ride for the county seat, he said, and we don't stop. They left before the bodies were cold. Jace wrapped them in oilcloth and moved them outside. He wasn't sentimental about it, but he didn't leave men in doorways. Old habit from the war. When leaving the dead in the open meant something about the unit that left them. He packed what was worth packing, killed the fire, and had the horse ready inside 40 minutes. Clara didn't argue about the pace. She moved with the focused efficiency of someone who understood exactly how much time they didn't have. They rode double through the last of the snowfall. Jace's horse, a solid gray mare, named absolutely nothing, because Jace didn't name horses picking her way down the mountain trail with the careful attention that good horses give to bad footing. The cold was brutal, but the wind had dropped. The sky was starting to pale in the east. About 2 miles down the trail, Clara said, the men Thorne hires, he pays double rate and asks no questions. He's been doing it for years. How many does he have working for him in Oakhaven? 6 enforcers plus the sheriff. She paused. The sheriff isn't a bad man. He's just a man who owes more than he can pay. Jace thought about that. He knew that math, too. By mid-morning, they found a dry creek bed that cut east, sheltered by cottonwoods on both sides, invisible from the trail above. Jace followed it for half a mile before he stopped and swung down. We stop here, he said. 20 minutes. Horse needs water, and you need to eat. There was a thin trickle, still moving under a skin of ice at the creek's edge. Jace broke it open with his boot heel and let the mare drink while he built a small fire fast and hot, the kind that doesn't last but serves its purpose. He had hard bread and a piece of dried venison in his saddlebag. He split both portions down the middle without asking. Clara sat on a fallen cottonwood and held the tin box in her lap. She hadn't let it leave her hands for more than a few minutes since they'd ridden out. "You should know what's in here," she said, "before we get to the county seat, before you decide how far into this you're willing to go." He looked at her across the small fire. "All right." She set the box on the log beside her and opened it with a small key she wore on a cord around her neck. Inside, packed flat and wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture, was a stack of documents maybe 2 inches thick. She sorted through them with care, deliberate, organized, like she'd been through them many times, and knew exactly what was where. "This," she said, holding up the first one, "is the original deed to the Alvarez water rights. The dam that feeds the whole valley was built on their land in 1869. Their family farmed that section for 11 years. She set it down. This is a second deed, dated 1874, signed over to Reverend Josiah Thorne, witnessed by 2 men who both died within the year." She looked up. "The Alvarez family didn't sell. I watched it happen. Josiah told Miguel Alvarez that the bank had called his mortgage a mortgage Josiah himself held under a false business name, and that the only way to keep his family from being put out in winter was to sign the water rights over." Jace looked at the 2 documents side by side. He was not a lawyer, but he could read, and the difference between a coerced transfer and a willing one didn't require a law degree to understand. "How many families?" he asked. 14 that I documented. There are more, but these are the ones I have proof for." She went through the stacks slowly, holding up deed after deed, laying out the pattern with the precision of someone who had spent years collecting each piece and understood exactly what the whole picture meant. He uses the same method every time. He holds the debt through the bank, through the false business, through the church tithe fund, and when a family falls behind, he offers them a choice: sign over the land or lose everything. She paused. "Sometimes the choice comes with a personal requirement." "What kind of personal requirement?" Clara's voice didn't waver. "He took 3 daughters. 2 of them were 14. He called it a work arrangement and told the families the girls would be housed in the church and given wages." She looked at Jace directly. There were no wages. The fire popped. A blue jay somewhere in the cottonwoods made its sharp, irritated sound and then went quiet. Jace looked at the documents. He thought about the 500 poster and the word "dangerous" printed next to her name. "He controls the water," he said slowly, "so he controls the ranchers. He controls the ranchers, so he controls the town. He controls the town, so no one talks. Every family in Oakhaven owes something to Josiah. A debt, a favor, a secret he's keeping for them. They're not loyal because they believe in him. They're silent because they can't afford not to be." She stacked the documents carefully, wrapped them back in the oilcloth, and pressed them flat. "When I tried to tell people when I first understood what was happening and tried to talk to anyone about it, nobody would listen. They couldn't. Agreeing with me would have cost them everything. So instead they watched," Jay said. "They watched," she said, "and they looked away when he burned half my face off." She said it plainly. No performance in it, just the flat, steady weight of a thing that happened. Jace was quiet. She closed the tin box and locked it. "You want to know why I married him," she said. It wasn't really a question. I wasn't going to ask. Most people would. She set the box in her lap. "My father owed money. Josiah forgave the debt in exchange for my hand. I was 19. My father thought he was doing me a kindness. Josiah was prosperous and respected and wore a collar." She looked down at the box. "I didn't know. Nobody tells you. You're supposed to be grateful." "When did it start?" "The first year." She touched the edge of the tin box with one finger. "Small things first, then larger ones. Then the kind of things you can't explain to anyone. Because the moment you say them out loud, you sound like you're inventing them. She paused. He burned me the night I found the ledger. I'd been quietly collecting documents for 2 years by that point, copying records when he was away, keeping them in the lockbox under the stable floor. He found out somehow. He always found out. She lifted her eyes. He held me down, and he did it with a fireplace poker. And then he went to his study and wrote a sermon about mercy. The fire had burned down to coals. The mare stood at the creek's edge, quiet and patient. Somewhere above them, the sky was fully light now, pale winter blue with no clouds left. The ledger, Jace said. You mentioned a ledger at the church. The master record. Every transaction, every coerced deed, every bribe, every name. He keeps it in a safe in the church because he believes God protects it. She almost smiled. It's more comprehensive than anything I collected myself. If a judge has my documents, he has enough to act. If he also has the ledger, there's no defense Josiah can make. So we need both. We need both. Jace stood up and kicked dirt over the coals. The county seat is a 2-day ride in this weather, he said. The sheriff there, Amos Vance. You said you knew him. I know of him. He has a reputation for being straight. He and I rode together once, Jace said, years back, before he took the badge. He was quiet a moment, looking at the trail east. He's a good man. Or he was. Clara watched him. A lot can change a man, she said. Yeah. He turned and gathered the horse's reins. A lot can. He mounted and reached down for her. She took his hand and swung up behind him with the practiced ease of someone who'd grown up around horses. She held the tin box against her ribs with one arm and put her free hand against his side. Not around him, just enough contact to stay balanced. They rode east along the creek bed. The sun was up properly now, catching the snow on the upper peaks and turning it blinding white. Down in the valley, it was still gray and cold. The kind of cold that settles into your coat and works inward, no matter what you do. But the blizzard was over. Clara looked back once. The mountains behind them were still and white and enormous, indifferent to everything that happened in their shadow. She turned forward again. Jace rode without talking, which suited her fine. She sat behind him and watched the country open up ahead and thought about the 14 families in her documents, and the 3 daughters and the 6 enforcers, and the sheriff who owed more than he could pay. She thought about a judge in the county seat who supposedly didn't belong to anyone. She thought about how much weight the word supposedly had to carry. The mare moved steadily east. The cold pressed in from all sides, and the tin box rode against her ribs like a heartbeat, steady and hard, and full of everything a corrupt man thought he'd buried. The town of Millhaven sat at the bottom of a long slope, surrounded by bare cottonwoods and frozen mud, looking like it had been dropped there by accident and never quite recovered. 2 streets, a general store, a telegraph office, a jailhouse with a tin roof that rattled in the wind, and Sheriff Amos Vance, who was standing on the front steps of that jailhouse when Jace and Clara rode in, like he'd been expecting them for a while and wasn't sure how he felt about it. He was heavier than Jace remembered, grayer at the temples. He had the posture of a man carrying something that didn't show on the outside shoulders, a little too square, jaw a little too set. The kind of rigid stillness that comes from years of holding yourself together by force of will. He looked at Jace first, then at Clara. His eyes stayed on her longer than was polite, taking in the scars, the tin box, the road dust covering both of them. His face didn't change, but something moved behind his eyes. Cordova, he said, you look like you rode through a blizzard. 2 days ago, we made decent time. Amos nodded slowly. He looked at Clara again, then back at Jace. Come inside, he said, both of you. The jailhouse was warm, which was the best thing that could be said for it. A cast iron stove in the corner burned hard wood and threw real heat. There was a desk, 2 chairs, a rack of rifles on the wall, and 2 empty cells in the back. It smelled like tobacco and old coffee and the particular staleness of a building that never quite aired out. Amos poured coffee from a black pot without asking and set 3 cups on the desk. He sat down behind it. Jace and Clara took the chairs across from him. Nobody spoke for a moment. The coffee was terrible and very hot. "I got a wire this morning," Amos said. "From Oakhaven." "From Reverend Thorne." Jace set down his cup. "He says a dangerous fugitive is making her way toward the county seat with stolen property and false documents." Amos looked at Clara. "He says she's mentally unstable and that her husband is very concerned for her safety." "Her husband," Jace said, "put a fireplace poker to her face." Amos looked at the scars again. His jaw tightened slightly. "He also says," Amos continued, "that the man she's traveling with is a wanted felon who has been harassing citizens of Oakhaven and threatening to extort the Reverend." He paused. "That part I knew was nonsense before I finished reading it. But the rest of it I needed to hear from you directly." Clara opened the tin box. She laid the documents on the desk one at a time, the same way she'd laid them out for Jace in the creek bed, organized, deliberate, with clear explanation for each one. She was calm. Her voice was level. She had clearly done this before in her head, rehearsed the order and the logic, anticipated the questions a skeptical man would ask. Amos listened without interrupting. He picked up each document when she set it down. "Read it," set it aside. His coffee went cold. He didn't seem to notice. When she finished, he sat back in his chair. "These documents," he said, "if they're genuine, and I'm not saying they aren't, they represent land fraud on a significant scale, possibly criminal conspiracy, certainly grounds for a federal investigation." He folded his hands on the desk. "They're also the word of a woman against a preacher, in a county where that preacher has more friends than I do. I understand the difficulty," Clara said. "Do you?" He looked at her steadily. "Judge Calhoun is 60 miles south of here, 2 days' ride minimum. And Thorne's wire to me this morning means he already knows you're headed for the county seat. He'll have men on the road," Jace said. "There's more," Clara said. She leaned forward slightly. "At the church in Oakhaven, there's a master ledger. Every transaction, every name, every deed transfer, every bribe, every coerced agreement going back 12 years, in Josiah's own handwriting." Amos was quiet. "With the ledger and these documents together," Clara said, "there's no defense, no claim of forgery, no question of my credibility. The ledger corroborates every page in this box. The ledger is in Oakhaven, in Thorne's church, yes." Amos picked up his coffee, looked at it, set it back down. He stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the empty street. The wind pushed a tumbleweed past the general store. Somewhere down the street, a sign creaked on its chain. "I grew up in this county," he said. His back was to them. "My father ranched 12 miles north of here. I took this badge because I believed in it, in what it meant." He was quiet a moment. 4 years ago, my family ranch had a bad winter, lost half the herd. I borrowed against the land to keep going. The bank that held the note he stopped was Thorne's," Clara said quietly. "I didn't know that until it was too late." He turned around. His face was controlled, but his eyes were not. "He called the note last fall, gave me a choice, keep the badge, and keep my family's land for another 2 years, or fight him and lose both." He looked at Jace. "I've been carrying that for 7 months." The stove ticked. The wind rattled the tin roof. "Amos," Jace said, "the wire he sent this morning. Does that mean he's already got men moving toward this town?" Amos walked to the window again and looked out, not at the street this time, at the road coming in from the west. 4 riders were coming down the slope, moving at a steady pace, not rushing, like men who knew they had the numbers and weren't worried about what they'd find when they arrived. "Thorne's enforcers," Clara said. She'd stood up and was looking past Amos's shoulder. "The one in front, big coat. Gray horse, that's Dolan. He runs the crew." "How many bullets does he take to stop?" Jace asked. "Jace," Amos said. "That's a real question." Amos turned from the window. He looked at Clara. He looked at the documents spread across his desk. He looked at his hands. Then he walked to the rifle rack and took down a shotgun. "There's a back door," he said. "Alley leads to the livery. Your horse is still there." He looked at Jace. "Tied out front. I'll get her moved." He checked the shotgun loaded, both barrels. "You take the tin box, and you go out the back. I'll send a telegraph to Judge Calhoun before they get to the office." Calhoun needs to know what's in those documents before Thorne gets a chance to wire his own version. Amos, Clara said. What happens to you? He looked at her. I'm the sheriff, he said simply. This is my jailhouse. That's not an answer. No, he said. I suppose it isn't. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a ring of keys. He held them out to Jace. These open the church in Oakhaven. Side door. East wall. I've been there to collect tax documentation twice. The safe is behind the altar, behind a false panel in the wall. Combination is 4 right. 9 left, 4 right. Jace took the keys. You memorized the combination, Clara asked. I'm a careful man, Amos said, or I used to be. He went to the front door and looked out through the small glass window beside it. The 4 riders were at the end of the street now. Dolan had seen the horses outside the jailhouse. He was slowing down. Go, Amos said. Right now. Amos, Jace started. I know what I'm doing. He turned around and looked at Jace directly. The gray at his temples, the extra weight. The years of carrying something too heavy, all of that, was still there. But underneath it was something else. Something that had been buried under debt and compromise, and the grinding daily reality of a bargain he'd never wanted to make. It had a particular look about it. Jace recognized it because he'd seen it in the mirror on the morning he dropped the wanted poster into the stove. It was a man deciding. Get the ledger, Amos said. Burn the place down if you have to. Just make sure the ledger makes it out. He turned back to the door and put his hand on it. Clara crossed the room in 3 steps and grabbed his arm. Amos looked down at her hand, then at her face. The family's in Oakhaven, she said. Miguel Alvarez. The Hendersons. The Parkers. They have names. Sheriff. They are real people. And they have been waiting a long time for someone with a badge to act like their lives mattered. Amos looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. And then, more quietly, I know their names. He opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. Jace grabbed the documents off the desk, stuffed them in the tin box, locked it, and handed it to Clara. He was at the back door in 4 steps. They went out into the alley at a run. Behind them, through the walls, they heard Amos's voice loud and official, carrying the full weight of the badge he'd worn for 4 years, telling Dolan and his men to dismount, telling them they were in his town now, telling them the law applied to everyone who rode into Millhaven, including men who worked for preachers. Then they heard the first shot. Jace got the mare from the livery in under 2 minutes. He threw Clara up first and swung up behind her reverse of how they'd been riding, so he could watch the rear. They went out the back of the livery at a full gallop, hitting the frozen road east before anyone in the street could see which direction they'd gone. Clara didn't look back. Jace did. The jailhouse roof was still standing when they crested the hill. That was all he could see. He turned forward and rode hard, and neither of them spoke about what they'd left behind. 3 miles out of Millhaven, Clara said. He sent the telegraph before we arrived. That's why he was waiting on the steps. He'd already done it. Jace looked at her. He knew we were coming, she said. Someone wired ahead. He had time to send the telegraph to Calhoun before we even walked through the door. She paused. He was ready for us. He'd already decided. Jace thought about that for a mile. The marshals, he said. How long? 2 days minimum. If Calhoun acts immediately. 3 more likely. Then we have 3 days to get the ledger out of that church. Clara held the tin box against her chest. The road stretched ahead, flat and frozen and empty under the winter sky. Then we ride for Oakhaven, she said. Jace clicked his tongue and pushed the mare faster. They didn't sleep until they were 40 miles from Millhaven. Jace found a dry hollow in the hillside, barely big enough for the 2 of them and the horse, sheltered by a limestone overhang and a stand of junipers that cut the wind. He built the smallest fire he could manage, enough to keep their fingers working, not enough to throw light beyond the hollow. Clara sat against the limestone and ate without tasting anything. He did the same. The horse stood at the edge of the firelight, ears moving, scanning the darkness. After a while, Clara said, Do you think he's alive? Amos J. stoked the fire. He's a hard man to kill. And 4 to 1 isn't as bad as it sounds when you're behind a locked door with a shotgun. You don't know that. No, he said. I don't. She looked at the fire for a while. He didn't have to do it, she said. He could have handed us over. Kept his land, kept his position, kept the arrangement with Thorne going indefinitely. People can only carry a bad bargain so long before it breaks them, or they break it, Jace said. Amos just hit his limit. What's yours? He looked at her. What's your limit? She said, before something breaks. He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. He didn't reach for a quick answer. I think I broke mine about a year back, he said. I took a job I shouldn't have taken. Brought in a man who turned out to be innocent. He went to prison for 8 months before the truth came out. He looked at the fire. I kept working after that, kept taking the jobs, but something was already broken. I just hadn't admitted it yet. Clara studied his face in the firelight, the scar on his jaw, the lines around his eyes. A person accumulates evidence of their life on their face, whether they intend to or not. Is that why you didn't turn me in? She asked. Partly. He was quiet a moment. Partly it was you. She waited. You were sitting in that train station, holding that box like it was the last thing you owned, he said. Fever burning through you. Half your face scarred, alone in a blizzard, and you were still holding on. He shook his head slightly. You weren't broken. I couldn't figure out why not. I had something to hold on for, she said simply. The documents. The families who'd been robbed. If I went down, that all went down with me. She looked at the tin box. It wasn't courage. It was just having a reason. Most people would call that the same thing. She didn't answer that. But she didn't disagree either. They slept in shifts. Jace took the first watch, then woke her at midnight. She sat against the limestone with his rifle across her knees and watched the darkness while he slept. The night was clear and very cold. Stars filled every inch of the sky above the hollow. The kind of sky you only get when you're far from towns and lamp oil and human noise. She watched them and thought about Oakhaven. She thought about the church, its dark wood pews, and the massive crucifix above the altar, and the smell of candle wax and old stone. She'd sat in that church for 5 years, played her role, kept her face composed, and her eyes forward and her opinions invisible. Watched Josiah preach about mercy and humility and the wages of sin to a congregation too afraid to look at each other. She'd hated every minute of it. She'd also learned every inch of it, where the floorboards creaked, where the shadows pooled deepest at night, which windows latched, and which ones didn't close fully because the frames had warped, where Josiah sat when he worked late and where he set his lamp. She'd been collecting that knowledge for 3 years. Not knowing exactly what she'd use it for, just knowing that one day she'd need it. She pressed her back against the cold limestone and watched the stars move. By the second morning, they were 30 miles from Oakhaven. The country was changing, getting flatter, opening up, the mountains receding behind them. The road here was used more regularly, which meant tracks in the frozen mud and the occasional distant smear of wood smoke on the horizon that meant a ranch or a homestead. They stayed off the main road and cut through open range, picking their way through frozen grass and dormant scrub. Jace rode without talking for long stretches, which Clara had come to understand was not unfriendliness. He was thinking. You could tell by the set of his shoulders. He went very still when he was working through a problem, like all his energy was going inward. I know the layout of the church, she said, breaking a long silence. He glanced at her. I can get us in through the north window. The latch is broken. It looks closed, but it doesn't catch. I've known that for 2 years. She paused. The safe is where Amos said. I've seen it once, when Josiah thought I was in bed. He was careless about the combination, because he didn't think I could read numbers. Could you? My father taught me accounting at 14. She said it flatly. Josiah never asked. Jace was quiet a moment. You watched him open it. Twice, from the doorway, with the lamp turned down. He never looked back. She paused. 4 right, 9 left. 4 right. Same as Amos said. So you already knew the combination before Amos gave it to us. Yes, he looked at her. Why didn't you just say that? Because it mattered that Amos knew it too, that he'd been paying attention, in spite of everything. It meant he wasn't entirely lost. She shifted her position on the horse. Also, I wanted to see if the numbers matched. Jace turned forward again. They matched, he said. They matched, she said. Another mile of silence. There'll be someone watching the church, Jace said. Thorn will know we're heading back for the ledger. It's the obvious move. Dolan, if he's not still in Millhaven. Dolan might be behind us. I know. Clara. He stopped the horse and turned around to look at her directly. She was riding behind him. Her chin level, her eyes steady. I need you to hear me when I say this. Going into that church is the most dangerous thing we've done yet. More dangerous than the cabin. More dangerous than Millhaven. Thorn will be expecting it. I know, she said again. I want you to wait outside. Cover the exit. If something goes wrong. No, Clara. I've been waiting outside for 5 years, she said. I waited outside while he took the Alvarez land. I waited outside while he made his arrangements with the Henderson girl. I kept quiet, and I looked away and I waited. Her voice was perfectly steady. I'm not waiting outside anymore. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned forward and clicked his tongue at the mare. All right, he said. Then we go in together. And you do exactly what I say when I say it. Agreed, she said. And you do the same when I say it. He almost smiled. They stopped at a farmstead 8 miles west of Oakhaven abandoned. The roof partially collapsed, but the barn still standing and dry. They put the horse in the barn with enough hay and water to last through the night. They ate. They went over the plan 3 times from beginning to end until each step was clear. The church sat at the north end of Oakhaven's Main Street. It was the largest building in town, 2 stories, dark wood, a bell tower that Josiah had added in 1872 as a statement of permanence and power. The safe was behind the altar in a false wall. The north window was 12 feet off the ground. They'd need something to stand on. The pew nearest the window was solid oak and fixed to the floor, which meant they couldn't move it. Jace would boost her up. Once we have the ledger, Jace said, we don't stop. We go straight for the road south. Calhoun's men will be coming from that direction, and if Dolan's men are between us and the road south, then we go through them. Clara looked at him. That's the plan, he said. That's not a plan. That's a description of a problem. I'm working on the second part. She picked up a stick and drew the church layout in the dirt floor of the barn, the main entrance. The side door Amos's key opened. The north window, the altar, the false wall behind it. She drew the street outside, the buildings across from it, the alley running along the east side. Dolan will put 1 man inside and 1 or 2 outside, she said. That's how he's always worked. The man inside will be near the front, near the main entrance. He'll have a lamp turned low. Jace studied the dirt map. If we come in through the north window, he said, we're behind the altar before he knows we're there. We need to deal with him before he makes noise. Yes, you know how to do that without killing him. Jace looked up. Yes, good, she said. I'd rather not leave more bodies if we can help it. Most of Thorne's men are hired hands. They're not all worth dying for. He studied her. You've thought a lot about this. I've had 3 years of planning and 5 days of riding. Yes, I've thought about it. She looked at the dirt map. The outside men are the real problem. Once we have the ledger, and we're coming back out through that window, we'll be exposed for about 15 seconds before we can get into the alley. I can be fast in 15 seconds. So can they. What are you proposing? She picked up the stick and drew a mark at the corner of the alley. There's a grain storage shed at the alley corner, she said. The church uses it for supplies. It's full right now. I saw it filled in October. Flour, dried corn, lamp oil stored in the back corner. She paused. If something draws Dolan's outside men to the far end of that alley, before we come out the window, a fire, Jace said. A small one. Enough smoke to pull them away. The shed is stone, so it won't burn the town. He looked at her. You've been planning to burn things, he said. I've been planning to survive, she said. There's a difference. He looked at the dirt map for a while. Then he picked up the stick and made 2 marks, 1 at the north window, 1 at the alley corner. We set the distraction first, he said. Then we go in. 10 minutes for the smoke to pull them. In and out, before it gets bad enough to alert the whole street. Yes, and if Thorne is in the church himself. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then we deal with Thorne, she said. Jace put the stick down. He looked at her across the dirt map in the failing light of the barn, with the horse shifting quietly behind him and the cold pressing in at the gaps in the wood. "You're not the woman on that wanted poster," he said. "No," she said. "I never was." He nodded once. Slowly. They waited for dark. Oak Haven at midnight was not entirely still. There were lamps in a few windows. The saloon at the south end of the street ran past midnight on weekdays, and one or two homesteads kept late hours. But the church at the north end was dark. From a distance, it looked like every other closed building on the street, just a large dark shape against a slightly lighter sky. Jason and Clara came in from the east, cutting through the backlots behind the general store and the feed merchant, keeping low, using the buildings for cover. The ground was frozen hard, and their footsteps were quiet. They moved slowly. There was no wind, which was good sound carried on still nights. But they weren't making much. They stopped at the corner of the last building before the alley. Jace looked at the church, then at the grain storage shed, at the alley corner, then back at the church. Two men outside, one near the main entrance, stamping his feet against the cold. One at the far corner of the building, partly visible, his breath making small clouds in the dark air. One inside, Clara said, barely a breath in his ear. "Look at the third pew from the front, left side. There's a shape in the shadow." He looked. She was right. A man sitting in the pew, lamp turned so low it barely registered as light, waiting. Jace reached into his coat and pulled out a small tin, the kind he carried matches in. He handed it to Clara. She looked at him. "Shed first," he whispered. "East side. There's old burlap stacked against the wall from the harvest deliveries. Get it smoking. Don't let it get ahead of you." She nodded. "You have 3 minutes," he said. "Then I go in." She took the tin and moved. She didn't run. She walked carefully along the far side of the alley, pressed close to the building walls, pausing when the man at the far corner shifted his weight. He didn't turn. She reached the shed, found the burlap exactly where she expected it, and worked quickly. She'd started fires before in the kitchen, in the laundry shed, in fireplaces that hadn't been cleaned properly. She knew how to make fire take hold, and how to make it climb slowly rather than jumping. She needed smoke first, flames second. The burlap caught. She moved back to the alley corner and watched it breathe. Gray smoke curling up through the gaps in the shed wall. Not dramatic, just enough. The man at the far corner of the church noticed it first. He stood up straight and looked. Then he said something low to the man near the main entrance, and they both moved toward the shed. Clara went back to Jace. He was already moving to the north wall of the church. The window was 8 feet up, smaller than a door. Dark glass in a plain frame. He laced his fingers together and looked at her. She put her boot in his hands, and he lifted her in one smooth motion. She caught the sill. Checked the latch. It swung inward exactly as she'd said it would. She went through. The inside of the church was very dark. The smell hit her immediately. Old candle wax, wood polish, something faintly chemical she'd never been able to identify. She knew this smell. She'd breathed it for 5 years. It sat in her chest like a stone. She was behind the altar, exactly where she'd calculated. She could see the man in the pew from here, his back to her, head slightly bowed, either dozing or praying. The lamp beside him threw a small circle of amber light that didn't reach the altar. Jace came through the window behind her. He was larger than her, and the frame was tight, but he moved quietly. His boots found the floor without sound. She turned and pointed at the false wall behind the altar. He nodded. She went to the wall and pressed along the edge, feeling for the seam in the dark. Her fingers found it, a slight depression, a horizontal edge. She pressed, and the panel swung inward 6 inches. She caught it before it could go further and eased it open. The safe was there, cast iron, bolted to the stone floor, about the size of a steamer trunk's worth of cabinet. She turned to Jace, who crouched beside her and put his hand on the dial. 4 right, 9 left, 4 right. She heard the mechanism click. He pulled the handle. The safe swung open. There were papers, cash in bound stacks, a small lockbox she didn't recognize, a leather folder, and there, at the front, a thick leather-bound book, wide format, dense with entries. The cover worn at the corners from years of use. She reached in and took the ledger. She held it for a moment in both hands. 12 years of Josiah Thorne's methodical record-keeping. Every transaction, every name, every crime committed in ink and witnessed by God, and now held in the hands of the woman he'd thought he'd silenced permanently. She breathed. Then the lamp in the third pew went out in the sudden dark. Someone said, "I wondered if you'd come back." Josiah's voice was exactly as she remembered it. Measured, almost gentle. The voice he used from the pulpit. When he was about to say something, he wanted people to feel as well as hear. She'd always hated that voice, most of all. Jace moved in front of her immediately, putting himself between her and the sound. A lamp flared, not the one in the pew, one near the side door. Josiah was standing there, lamp in one hand, a revolver in the other, and behind him were two more men, not Dolan's hired hands. These were different, better dressed, men who'd been waiting inside since dark. The man in the pew wasn't dozing. He was standing now, cutting off the window exit. It was a trap, not an accident, a deliberate one, constructed by a man who knew exactly how Clara thought, because he'd spent 5 years studying her. "Clara," Josiah said. His voice was almost sad. "You were always so determined. I never could make you stop." She stepped out from behind Jace. Josiah's eyes went to the ledger in her hands, and something moved across his face, quick and ugly. There and gone. "Set that down," he said. "No," she said. Jace had his gun up. The two men behind Josiah had theirs up. The man from the pew was moving along the far wall. The numbers were not good, and everyone in the room knew it. "Cordova," Josiah said pleasantly. "I'm told you're a practical man. There are 4 guns on you. Whatever she's paying you, it isn't worth this." "She isn't paying me anything," Jace said. "Then you're doing this out of sentiment." Josiah tilted his head. "That's unexpected. I didn't take you for that type. I'm full of surprises." Clara looked at the overhead. She'd mapped this in the barn, in the dirt. With a stick, she'd gone through the church layout a dozen times in her head. She knew where the beams were. She knew which ones were load-bearing and which were decorative. She knew about the oil lamps hung on iron hooks along the nave, filled monthly, checked weekly. She knew which one hung directly above the space between Josiah and the altar. She knew it was full. She had 1 shot. She'd borrowed Jace's secondary pistol 2 miles outside of Oakhaven and put it in her coat pocket and hadn't told him why. He'd noticed he noticed everything, but he hadn't asked. She pulled it now. Josiah's eyes flicked to her and his face changed. She fired. The shot hit the iron hook. The lamp dropped. It hit the crossbeam below it, and the oil went in every direction across the beam, across the section of wall beside it, across the dry old wood of the pew backs in a wide, generous arc. The flame followed the oil with the immediate enthusiasm that fire shows when it finds what it's been looking for. The room erupted. The men behind Josiah scattered backward. Josiah himself lurched sideways, away from the burning wall, and Jace was already moving, crossing the distance to the man from the pew before he could get his shot off, hitting him hard and low, sending them both into the seats. 3 shots in quick succession, all of them going wide in the chaos. The fire climbed the wall fast, jumping from beam to beam, throwing orange light and black smoke across everything. Jace went down. She saw it happen. A shot from the doorway caught him in the left shoulder, spinning him sideways into the pew. He caught himself on the backrest and stayed upright, but his gun hand was wrong, the angle gone. He fired once more, and then his shoulder gave, and he dropped to one knee. Clara moved. She crossed the church floor with the ledger under one arm, grabbed Jace's right arm, and hauled upward. He came to his feet. She could feel how much it cost him, the weight of him leaning into her, for just a moment before he steadied. She didn't let go of his arm. "Window," she said. Josiah's voice rose above the fire. "Don't let them leave with that book." She heard boots on the floor behind them. She didn't look back. Jace took 3 steps and made a platform with his hands. His left arm was compromised, but he took her weight for a second, and she went through the window first, dropping to the ground outside and landing in a crouch. She turned and reached back. He pushed through the frame, too wide for it. catching shoulder on the edge and making no sound despite it, dropping down beside her. They ran. The alley was empty. The smoke from the shed had done its job, pulling Dolan's outside men to the far end. They went through the dark space at a dead run, Jace matching her pace even with his shoulder, his hand pressed to the wound and his jaw locked. The church behind them was showing light through every gap in the walls now. The bell tower caught as they reached the alley's end, and the bell began to ring, not struck by anyone, just ringing from the heat, wild and continuous and loud. The whole town was going to wake up. Horse, Jace said. East lot, she said. 2 streets over. They ran. Behind them she heard Josiah's voice and then shouting, and then the particular confused noise of a town suddenly awake to fire and fear. She ran and held the ledger and didn't look back, and the bell kept ringing and ringing, and the orange light of the burning church climbed above the rooftops and lit the whole street like daylight. They got to the horse. She was already saddled. Jace had done it before they'd gone in, which she'd noticed and not commented on. He was a careful man, in his way. He swung up with his good arm, and she came up behind him, and they were moving before either of them said another word. South Road. Wide, open and frozen and empty in the pre-dawn dark. A mile out. Jace's breathing was wrong. She could hear it. She put her hand on his back and felt the tension in him, not pain, exactly, but the concentrated effort of managing pain, which is something different. How bad, she asked. Through and through, he said. Didn't hit bone. I'd know. You're losing blood. Some, Jace. I've lost blood before. He kept the mare moving. There's cloth in the left saddlebag. Can you reach it? She reached. Found it. She packed the wound as best she could from behind, one arm around him, the mare going at a steady canter. He hissed once and then went quiet. She tied off the cloth. Her hands were dark in the darkness. I've got the ledger, she said. Good, he said. I've got both of them, the ledger and the documents. He was quiet for a moment. You know what that means. It means it's over, she said. It means the marshals will have everything they need. It means you're safe, he said. For the first time since I've known you, you're actually safe. She held the cloth to his shoulder and looked at the road ahead, black and long and leading south, toward Calhoun, toward Marshall's, toward the end of the thing that had been driving her for 3 years. The church bell was still ringing behind them, faint now with distance. The sky in the east had the very first suggestion of gray at its edges. She held on to him. The horse ran south. Dawn came in slow. The sky went from black to dark blue to a pale, washed-out gray that didn't quite commit to morning. The air was still and very cold. Frost had settled overnight on every flat surface, the fence rails, the windowsills, the water trough in front of the livery, and it caught the first light and held it. So the whole town of Oakhaven glittered faintly in the early hour like something that hadn't decided yet whether to be beautiful or just cold. The church was still smoldering. It had burned through the night, not a total collapse, because the stone foundation and the outer walls had held, but the interior was gone. The roof had caved sometime around 3 in the morning, sending a column of orange sparks up into the dark sky that people saw from their bedroom windows and didn't come out to investigate, not because they didn't care, because they'd learned, over 12 years, that caring out loud carried a price by the time the sun was actually up, a flat winter sun. No warmth in it. About 30 people had gathered at the north end of the main street and were standing in the road looking at the smoking ruin. They stood apart from each other the way people do when they're not sure yet whether they're a crowd or just a collection of individuals who happen to end up in the same place. Nobody was talking much. They looked at the church and then at each other and then back at the church. Reverend Josiah Thorne was not among them. He'd been seen an hour earlier, moving fast down the main street toward the telegraph office, his coat singed at the hem, and his face carrying the particular expression of a man running a calculation in his head. 2 of his remaining enforcers were with him, not Dolan, who hadn't come back from Millhaven, but 2 younger men who'd been hired 6 months back and were starting to understand they'd taken a job that was not what it had appeared to be. Josiah sent 3 telegraphs in rapid succession. To federal contacts he believed he still had. To a lawyer in Denver he'd been paying retainer for a decade. To the territorial governor's office, where he had 2 friends who owed him favors. Then he went back to his house behind the ruined church, locked the door, and stayed there. He still believed the game could be won. That was the thing about Josiah Thorne. He'd been winning for so long that losing had become genuinely inconceivable to him in his understanding of the world. Power was the only real currency, and he had spent 12 years accumulating it carefully. A burned church could be rebuilt. Documents could be disputed. Women could be discredited. Men could be bought. He sat in his study and waited to be proven right. He didn't know about the ledger. Clara and Jace rode into Oakhaven from the south at 8 in the morning. They came in openly, on the main road, at a walk. Jace's shoulder was dressed properly. Now they'd stopped at a farmhouse 4 miles out, where a woman named Ruth Hendricks, whose family name appeared 3 times in Clara's documents, had taken one look at the wound and one look at the ledger in Clara's arms and let them in without a word. She'd cleaned and packed the wound with steady hands, fed them both, and pressed a jar of beef broth on them for the road. "You're really going back in?" Ruth had asked Clara. "Yes," Clara said. Ruth had looked at her for a long moment. "My daughter's name is in that box of yours. Eleanor. She was 15 when he made the arrangement with my husband." Her voice was flat and even and carried the weight of something she'd been holding for a very long time. "My husband believed he had no choice. I've never blamed him for that. But I've never stopped wanting someone to answer for it." "Someone will," Clara said. Ruth had stood on her porch and watched them ride out. Clara had looked back once and seen her still standing there, arms crossed against the cold, watching them go south to north, toward a town that had spent years teaching her family to look the other way. Now they were in that town. The 30 people in the road saw them coming, and nobody moved. Clara was riding behind Jace, the tin box in her lap, the ledger tucked inside her coat. Jace rode with his right hand visible and his left arm in a sling Ruth had fashioned from a flour sack. His face was expressionless. They stopped in front of the general store. Jace swung down and helped Clara down, which she didn't strictly need, but accepted because his shoulder needed a reason not to move suddenly. She looked at the crowd. She'd known some of these faces for 5 years. Miguel Alvarez, who'd built the dam on his own land and lost it before his youngest was born. Thomas Henderson, who ran the feed merchant and whose daughter Eleanor had gone to work for the church at 15 and come home 2 years later with her eyes permanently changed. Ada Parker, 70 years old, who'd had her 40-acre vegetable plot absorbed into Thorne's land holdings through a debt she'd never fully understood, and who now rented the same plot back from him at a rate that ensured she'd never get ahead. Carl Bishop, the blacksmith, who'd been told his forge permit depended on his continued cooperation with Thorne's economic arrangements, and who had gone quiet and large and unhappy behind his anvil for the past 3 years. She'd looked away from all of them, not because she didn't care, because she'd been learning how to stay alive. And staying alive meant not drawing attention. And not drawing attention meant keeping her eyes forward and her mouth shut. She stepped away from the horse and toward the steps of the general store. She climbed the 3 steps to the porch, which put her above the level of the road. The crowd watched her. Nobody spoke. She reached inside her coat and took out the ledger. She held it up so they could see it. A big, worn, leather-bound book, ordinary looking. Really, nothing about its appearance suggested what it contained. "My name is Clara Sterling," she said. "Most of you know that. Most of you knew me as Clara Thorne, which is not a name I'm using anymore." Her voice was carrying. The street was quiet enough that it didn't need to be loud. "This is the master ledger of Reverend Josiah Thorne." She held it up higher. 12 years of records. Every acre of land taken by coerced debt transfer. Every water right manipulated. Every bribe paid to keep a law officer looking the other direction. Every private arrangement made with a family in exchange for something a man of God had no right to ask for. The crowd was very still. "I'm going to read from it," she said, "and I want you to listen, because what's in here belongs to you, to all of you, and you have a right to hear it said out loud." She opened the ledger to the first marked page, November 1869. Water rights transfer from the Alvarez family. Section 14. Valle del Rio. Effective coercion via mortgage called on false business instrument. Consolidated land partners. Thorne's sole proprietor. She looked up and found Miguel Alvarez in the crowd. He was standing very still. "The dam you built on your own land, Mr. Alvarez, the one your father designed and your sons helped pour. He took it with a piece of paper and a fake company name, and you never knew until it was done." Miguel said nothing, but his wife, standing beside him, put her hand over her mouth. "Clara, read on." She read for 20 minutes. She read every major entry, the Henderson land, the Parker plot, the Bishop Forge permit, the school fund that Josiah had administered for the county and quietly redirected into his own accounts over a period of 8 years. She read the entries about the daughters, using their names, stating plainly what the arrangements had been and what they had actually involved. She read the bribe payments amounts, dates, recipients including Sheriff Amos Vance's name, with its accompanying notation. Mortgage leverage, reliable, to be maintained. She read that one and then looked up. "Sheriff Vance is dead," she said. "He died in Millhaven 2 days ago. He died holding the door closed with a shotgun so we could get out." She paused. "He sent a telegraph to Judge Calhoun before we arrived. He knew what it would cost him, and he did it anyway." Another pause. "His name is in this ledger as a man who was controlled. I want you to know that he did not stay controlled. That should be in the record, too." The crowd had changed. It had been 30 individuals when she started. It was something different. Now she could feel it. The shift in how people were standing. The way bodies had moved incrementally closer together without anyone deciding to do it. Thomas Henderson had his arm around his wife. Ada Parker had both hands on her cane and was standing very straight. Carl Bishop, the blacksmith, had moved forward 2 steps and was watching Clara with the focused attention of a man hearing something he'd been waiting to hear for a long time. She turned to the last marked entry. She didn't get to read it. The shot came from down the street. It went wide. She heard it pass. Felt the air of it on her left cheek, close enough to make her eyes close involuntarily. People in the crowd screamed and scattered sideways. Jace was moving. Before the sound finished, he came up the porch steps in 2 strides and put himself between Clara and the street, his right hand on his gun. Josiah was in the middle of the road. He looked nothing like the man who had stood at the pulpit for 12 years, with his hands folded, and his voice measured and his smile suggesting that he alone had access to a compassion the rest of the world was still working toward. He looked like a man who had lost his last piece of cover and didn't know yet what to do without it. His coat was singed. His hair was wrong. He had a revolver in his hand, and his eyes were moving fast across the crowd, calculating, looking for the angle that still existed, the deal that was still available. The lever he hadn't yet tried. "Clara." He said her name the way he'd always said it, like she was a child who'd been caught doing something foolish. "Come down from there." She didn't move. "This is over," she said. "You've stolen property belonging to this church," he said. He was pitching his voice for the crowd. Now she could hear the old training in it. The preacher's habit of playing to the room. "You've broken into a house of God and burned it to the ground. You've collaborated with a known criminal," he pointed at Jace. "And you've spent the last week telling slanderous lies to anyone who would listen." The crowd had gone very still again. "I have one question for you," Clara said. "Just one." He looked at her. "How many of these people owe you money?" she said. "Right now, today. How many of them are behind on a debt to a bank or a business that you own under a different name? How many of them came to you when they were desperate because you were the only money in the valley, and now they're trapped?" Josiah said nothing. "Because that's how it works," she said, and now she was talking to the crowd, turning to face them. "He's not a man of God. He's a creditor with a collar. The church is a collection mechanism. The sermons are how he keeps you grateful for the cage. She held up the ledger. It's all in here, in his own handwriting. Signed, dated, organized by year. He kept meticulous records because he was proud of it, because he believed he was too powerful to ever be held to account. Josiah raised the revolver. Miguel Alvarez stepped in front of Clara. He didn't say anything. He was a medium-sized man in a worn coat with calloused hands and a face that had been weathered by 20 years of outdoor work. He stepped in front of her and looked at Josiah and stood there. Thomas Henderson stepped up beside him, then his wife, then Ada Parker, who moved her cane forward and positioned herself with the deliberate steadiness of someone who had made a decision and was committing to it entirely. Then Carl Bishop, who was large enough that his presence beside the others changed the visual weight of the group considerably. Then Ruth Hendricks, who had ridden in from her farmhouse 4 miles out. Clara hadn't seen her arrive. Then more, one by one. People moved, not all of them. Some stayed back. Fear is real, and debt is real, and 12 years of conditioning doesn't dissolve in 20 minutes of public reading. But enough moved. Josiah stood in the road, with his revolver leveled at a wall of people who had apparently decided they were finished being afraid of him. His hand was shaking. She could see it from the porch steps, a fine tremor in the gun hand that he was trying to control and couldn't quite manage. He'd spent 12 years making people small. He'd done it systematically and skillfully, and he'd believed it was permanent. He'd never considered what happened when the smallness stopped being worth it. Jace stepped down from the porch. He walked into the street, unhurried, and stopped 10 feet from Josiah. His right hand was not on his gun. It was at his side, open. "You're not going to shoot through all of them," Jace said quietly. "And even if you did, there's a U.S. Marshal coming down that road." He tilted his head south, toward the road that led to the county seat. "Probably 2. Amos Vance sent that telegraph 2 days ago, and Judge Calhoun doesn't wait." Josiah's eyes went to the south road. It was empty, for now. "Lower the gun," Jace said. A long silence. The whole street. 30 people breathing. Josiah looked at the crowd, then at Jace, then at Clara, standing on the general store steps with the ledger in her hands and the morning sun on her scarred face. His arm dropped. Jace crossed the distance in 4 steps, took the revolver by the barrel, and put it in his own coat pocket. Josiah stood in the road and looked smaller than Clara had ever seen him look. He was still tall. He was still well-dressed. But something that had been in him, some core assumption that the world would arrange itself around his needs, had gone out. And without it, he was just a middle-aged man in a burned coat, standing in the mud. "Sit down," Jay said. Josiah sat down on the edge of the water trough. He sat there in the road, while the crowd stood around him, and Clara read the last entry in the ledger aloud from the porch steps of the general store. Then they waited for the marshals. The marshals arrived at 11 in the morning, 3 of them, riding in from the south at a steady trot, not rushing, not cautious, just moving at the pace of men who knew they had the authority and weren't interested in performing urgency. The one in front was a compact, gray-mustached man named Marshal Isaac Pruitt, who'd been riding for the federal court out of Denver for 16 years, and who had, in that time, developed a comprehensive skepticism toward everyone and everything, until proven otherwise. He looked at the crowd gathered in the street, at the smoking ruin of the church at the north end, at Josiah Thorne sitting on the edge of the water trough with his hands in his lap, at the woman on the porch steps holding a large leather book, at the man beside her with his left arm in a sling. He dismounted, he said, to the street in general. "I'm looking for Clara Sterling." "Here," Clara said. He walked to the porch steps and looked up at her. "Judge Calhoun sends his regards. He also sends instructions to collect one Reverend Josiah Thorne and whatever documentary evidence exists for the charges outlined in the telegraph received from A." He pulled out a folded paper and read from it. "A Sheriff Amos Vance of Millhaven. Amos is dead," Clara said. Pruitt looked at her steadily. "I know that. We came through Millhaven. We found the jailhouse. A pause. We found 3 of Thorne's men as well. 2 dead, 1 alive and cooperative. He folded the paper back up. Sheriff Vance's telegraph reached Judge Calhoun at 4 in the afternoon, 2 days back. The judge had us riding within the hour. He was a good man, Clara said. So I'm told. Pruitt looked at the ledger. Is that what I think it is? She handed it to him. He opened it, scanned 3 pages with the unhurried attention of someone who knew how to read documents and what to look for in them. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something in his posture did. He stood a fraction straighter, the way people do when they understand the weight of what they're holding. The other documents, he said. Clara unlocked the tin box and gave him everything. He handed the ledger and the box to one of the other marshals, who sat up at the table outside the general store and began going through it with the systematic care of someone building a case. The third marshal had already walked to where Josiah was sitting and was standing near him in a way that wasn't overtly threatening, but made it clear that the water trough was the right place to stay for now. Pruitt came back to Clara. I'll need your full account, he said. Everything, from the beginning. It'll take time. I know, she said. There'll be a formal proceeding in Denver. You'll be required to testify. I'll be there. He nodded. Then he looked at Jace, who was leaning against the porch rail with his right shoulder to the wall and his good arm crossed over his chest. Cordova, Pruitt said. Jace looked at him. Amos Vance's wire mentioned you. A pause. Mentioned you favorably, which surprised me, given your file. I have a file. Everyone has a file. Pruitt looked at him for a moment. You did good work here. That'll be noted. He turned back to the street, where one of his men was now speaking to Miguel Alvarez and writing in a notebook. Jace looked at Clara. She was watching the street with the focused attention of someone who had been running toward this moment for 3 years and had now arrived and wasn't entirely sure what to do with the stillness of it. The crowd had sorted itself into groups, some people speaking to the marshals. Some gathered in the clusters that form when people who've been isolated from each other start to remember their neighbors. Ada Parker was sitting on a bench outside the general store with her hands folded, watching everything with the calm attention of a woman who had seen a great many things and intended to see this through to the end. At noon, Pruitt walked to the water trough. He stood in front of Josiah and waited until the man looked up. Josiah had spent the morning sitting there in the road. He'd tried twice to speak, to explain, to reframe, to start the work of constructing a counter-narrative, and both times Pruitt's deputy had said, quietly and with no particular hostility, that he'd have his opportunity to speak at the proper time and the proper place, and that the water trough was neither. Josiah looked up at Pruitt now. Reverend Josiah Thorne, Pruitt said. He didn't use any particular ceremony. He wasn't theatrical about it. He simply said it the way you'd state a fact. You're under arrest on charges of land fraud, criminal conspiracy, extortion, and sexual misconduct against minors, among several additional charges that will be formalized in Denver. You'll be remanded to federal custody immediately. He paused. Do you understand what I've said? Josiah said. I want a lawyer. You'll have one. In Denver. Pruitt nodded to his deputy. They shackled Josiah's wrists in front of him, not behind, which he would have found more humiliating, but in front, which was actually more practical for transport, and which Pruitt preferred because it was less about theater and more about getting people safely from one place to another. The deputy helped him stand and walked him toward the horses. Josiah passed within 15 feet of the general store porch. He looked up as he did, couldn't help it. His eyes went to Clara. She looked back at him. No fear in her. No satisfaction, either, not the gloating kind. Just a steady, level look from a woman who had been through fire in more than one sense, and had come out the other side with her evidence intact, and her purpose served. She watched him the way you watch something that was once very large and is now measurably smaller, and you're noting the difference. Josiah looked away first. They loaded him onto a horse, his own horse, ironically, which the deputy had collected from the stable behind the ruined church. They tied his shackled wrists to the saddle horn with a length of rope, not cruelly but firmly, and they pointed him south. He was taken down the main street of Oakhaven at a walk. People watched him go. Some of them had sat in his church every Sunday for a decade. Some of them had taken his communion and sung his hymns and believed, or tried to believe, that he represented something true. Some of them were people he had robbed. Some were people whose daughters he had taken. Most were people who had simply been too afraid, for too long to do anything about what they suspected. They watched him ride out, and nobody said anything. No shouting, no rocks thrown. Just watching, the particular kind of watching that happens when something you've been bracing against for years finally passes you. The bell tower of the ruined church was still standing. Somehow, the structure around it had burned, but the tower itself stone, unlike the rest had held. The bell was cracked from the heat and would never ring properly again, but it was still there, black with soot, in the wreckage. Miguel Alvarez looked at it for a long time after Josiah was out of sight. Then he turned to his wife and said something Clara couldn't hear, and she nodded, and he walked over to where Pruitt's deputy was writing in the notebook, and he said, "I need to talk to someone about a water rights document. I need to understand what happens next." That was the beginning. Over the next 6 hours, while Pruitt and his deputies worked through the documents at the table outside the general store, people came, individually, in couples, in small family groups. They sat across from the deputies, and they told their stories haltingly at first, with the careful hedging of people who'd been punished for speaking before and hadn't entirely trusted yet that the punishment was over. But they came, and the deputies wrote everything down, and the pile of corroborating testimony grew alongside the written evidence in the tin box and the ledger. And by late afternoon, Pruitt had enough documentation for a case that would take a federal court several weeks to fully process, but would, he told Clara plainly, result in the restoration of land and water rights to their legitimate owners where they could be established. "It's a slow process," he said. "I want you to know that going in. The law moves at its own pace." "I know," Clara said, "but it moves." "It moves," he agreed. Jace had spent most of the afternoon sitting on the porch steps. His shoulder was properly painful by now. The adrenaline of the past several days had kept it manageable, but that was fading. Clara sat beside him at one point with a cup of coffee she'd gotten from the general store's stove, and they sat there watching the street work through its own reckoning. "You should have that looked at properly," she said. "A doctor, not a farm wife. Ruth Hendricks did fine work." "A doctor." "Jace." He looked at her. "There's one in the county seat. We're going that way anyway for the testimony. We're going that way." He looked out at the street. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what comes after the testimony. After all of it." He was quiet for a moment. "My brother's debt. The reason I took the bounty in the first place. I've been working through numbers in my head, and the federal reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction on land fraud charges of this scale is considerable." He looked at her sideways. "Pruitt told me this morning." Clara looked at him. "Enough to cover my brother's debt, with some left over," he said. "That's good." "It is." He was quiet again. "Means the original reason I was riding through that blizzard doesn't exist anymore." "What does that mean for you?" "Means I get to figure out a new reason." He looked at the street. "I've been doing this work for 8 years. Taking jobs, moving around, sleeping in places I don't have names for. It gets old." Clara watched a family she recognized, the Parkers. 3 generations of them talking to one of the deputies. The grandmother, Ada, was pointing at a document with one finger and explaining something in detail to a young man who was writing fast to keep up. "The valley is going to need help," Clara said, "getting the land transfers undone, understanding what they're entitled to. Someone who knows how systems work and how people take advantage of them." She paused. "That's not a quick job." "No," he said. "It's not." She looked at him. "I'm going to build a school," she said, "for the children of these families. Free of charge. I have the money. I've had it saved for 4 years. Put aside in a bank in Laramie under my maiden name where Josiah couldn't touch it." She paused. This valley's been robbed of enough. It won't be robbed of education. He looked at her. You've been planning that for 4 years. 3. The fourth year I spent mostly planning how to survive. He almost smiled. A school needs a builder, he said. I know a few ranchers who might help with the labor. She looked at the street. A town needs more than a school, though it needs honest accounting. Someone to look at the restored land deeds and make sure the transfer process isn't exploited again. That's a lot of work. Yes, she looked at him directly. It's also a reason. He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was doing something soft to the frost, still sitting in the shadows. The street smelled like wood smoke and cold air, and the particular aftermath of a long crisis, the strange, exhausted peace that settles when the thing you've been fighting is finally, measurably, over, right? He said. All right, what? All right, I'll stay. He looked out at the street again. Someone has to make sure you don't burn down anything else. She looked at the ruined church at the end of the street. That was necessary, she said. It was, he said. They sat there on the porch steps while Oakhaven slowly, carefully, began the work of putting itself back together. Spring came late to the valley. It always did up here. The mountains held the cold longer than the plains, kept winter pressed down into the hollows, and the creek beds well past the time when people were ready to stop living by the stove. But when it came with conviction. The snow retreated from the lower pastures first, exposing the mud and then the dead grass, and then, after a week of actual sun, the green underneath. The creek at the east edge of the Alvarez property ran full and loud, fed by snowmelt from the peaks, pouring through the dam sluice that Miguel had rebuilt over the course of March with help from Carl Bishop and Thomas Henderson, and 4 other men who'd shown up on a Monday morning with tools and no particular ceremony about it. The dam was his again, properly and legally. The deed had been restored in February, after 6 weeks of federal court proceedings in Denver that Clara had attended every day, sitting at the front, speaking when called upon, and watching Josiah Thorne's legal defenses dismantle one by one under the weight of his own meticulous record-keeping. He'd gotten 15 years. Federal penitentiary, no ecclesiastical considerations, no special accommodations. His lawyer, the expensive one from Denver, had tried 3 different angles, and none of them had found purchase. Because you can't argue with a man's own handwriting when the man was detailed enough to date and witness every transaction. Clara had been in the courtroom when the sentence was read. She'd sat very still and listened to the judge's voice and felt the words land with the particular finality that only a court ruling carries, not loud, not dramatic, just done. Permanent. Josiah had looked at her once before they took him out. Just once. Then he'd looked away, and she'd never seen his face again. She'd walked out of the courthouse into a cold February afternoon and stood on the steps for a while. Jace had been beside her. He hadn't said anything, which was exactly right. Now it was spring, late April, 1879. The school was built. It sat on the east side of Oakhaven's Main Street, between the feed merchant and the newly reopened telegraph office, on a lot that had technically belonged to the church's landholdings and had been assigned to community use by Judge Calhoun's order in January. It was a single room. Solidly made. Jace had done most of the design and a great deal of the actual carpentry, with his shoulder rebuilt over 6 weeks of rest that Clara had enforced through a combination of reasoned argument and removing his hammer from the site whenever he pushed too hard. The walls were straight. The windows were properly framed and faced south to catch the light. There were 8 desks inside, each one made from timber that Carl Bishop's son had milled from a stand of dead pines north of town. On the front wall hung a blackboard that Clara had ordered from a supplier in Denver and paid for out of the savings account in Laramie. Beside the blackboard, on a plain wooden hook, hung a small framed document, the original land deed for the Alvarez water rights, a copy of it, made by the federal court and certified as accurate, with a note attached in Clara's handwriting that read, "This land was stolen. It was taken back. Remember both." The school opened on a Monday in April with 11 children and Clara Sterling as the only teacher. She'd never formally taught before, but she'd been educated. Her father had seen to that. One of the few gifts he'd given her that Josiah hadn't been able to take. And she knew the curriculum she wanted: reading and writing, arithmetic, basic land surveying and accounting, enough geography to understand the world beyond the valley, and history, actual history, including the economic history of how land gets taken from people who work it and transferred to people who hold paper, and how that can be stopped when enough people understand the mechanism. It was the last part that Pruitt had raised an eyebrow at when she'd described it to him. "You're going to teach children about land law," he'd said. "I'm going to teach children how not to be robbed," she'd said. "That requires understanding what robbery looks like when it's wearing a suit." He'd shaken his head, but not in a way that suggested disagreement. On the morning of the school's opening, Clara stood at the front of the room and looked at 11 children between the ages of 6 and 13, including Miguel Alvarez's youngest, who was 4 and had come because his mother didn't have anyone to leave him with, and Clara had said to bring him along. They looked back at her with the variable attention that children bring to new things, some of them focused, some of them looking at the windows. One of them already occupied with a loose thread on his sleeve. She said, "Good morning. My name is Miss Sterling. We're going to start with reading, because everything else depends on it. Anyone who already knows how to read is going to help teach the ones who don't. That's how this school works. You learn it, then you help someone else learn it. Knowledge that stays with one person is just information. Knowledge that gets passed on is the only kind worth having." She picked up a primer and began. Jace finished the corral fence that same morning. Their cabin was 2 miles east of town, set into a south-facing hillside that caught afternoon sun and was sheltered from the north wind by a stand of mature pines. It wasn't large, one main room, a sleeping room, a porch facing the valley, but it was solid. He'd built it the way he built fires, consistently in the right order, with no shortcuts. The foundation was stone. The roof was proper timber. The porch had 2 chairs and a clear view of the mountain to the east. He drove the last nail into the corral fence at approximately 10 in the morning and stood back to look at it. 3 rails properly set, spanning 40 feet along the south side of the property, enough to run 2 horses, which was what they had: the gray mare he'd ridden through the blizzard, and a bay gelding he'd bought in Millhaven in March from the widow of a rancher who'd been selling off her late husband's stock. He set down the hammer. His shoulder was good. Not perfect. It would probably never be fully what it had been. And he'd learned in the past months to do certain things differently, to adapt his draw and his carry and the angle of his swing. But it worked. It was his, and it worked. And that was enough. He walked to the porch and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot Clara had left on the small outdoor stove before she'd ridden to town. He sat in one of the chairs and looked at the valley below. Spring was visible from up here in a way. It wasn't in town. You could see the whole floor of it. The green coming up in the low fields. The creek line marked by the willow trees starting to leaf out. The patches of bare earth where plowing had already started on the Alvarez section and the Henderson place. Smoke rising from chimneys that were still necessary in the mornings. A hawk turning slow circles above the ridge to the south. He'd been a bounty hunter for 8 years. Before that, briefly, the Army. Before that, a ranch in New Mexico that his family had lost in a drought year when he was 17. He had no particular illusions about what he was good at or what he wasn't. He was good at reading situations and reading people and making fast decisions under pressure and living with the consequences of those decisions. He was not, historically, good at staying in one place or trusting that the place would still be there in the morning. He was learning. He'd spent the winter helping several families in the valley navigate the process of reclaiming their land. It turned out that federal orders restoring property were the beginning of the process, not the end. There were taxes to account for, boundaries to resurvey, competing claims to resolve, and in 2 cases, Existing tenants who'd been placed on the land by Thorne's arrangement, and who were themselves innocent parties, caught in the middle. Jace had found that he had a particular usefulness in these situations. He could read a document clearly. He could explain a legal process in plain language. And when a conversation became difficult, as they sometimes did, when old resentments came to the surface, or when a man felt his pride required him to take a harder line, then the situation warranted he could be very direct in a way that moved things forward without escalating them. He wasn't being paid for it. That had seemed important to him, at the beginning, to be doing something, because it needed doing, and not because there was money at the end of it. He'd had enough of money being the thing that organized his decisions. He heard hoofbeats on the trail below. Clara came up the slope at a trot, the bay gelding moving easily under her. She'd gotten comfortable on a horse over the winter, in the way that people do when riding is simply how you get where you're going. She pulled up at the fence, looked at it, and said, "You finished it this morning." She swung down and tied the gelding to the new rail. She came up to the porch and took the other chair. "How was school?" he asked. "Good," she said. "Remarkable, actually." Miguel's youngest fell asleep after about 30 minutes, which I expected. But the Hendricks girl, Ruth's granddaughter, she already knows how to read better than some adults I've met. She was helping the others before I even asked her to. Clara paused. "I'm going to have to find her more advanced materials. She's going to outpace the primer inside 2 weeks. Right to the Denver Library," Jace said. "They have a lending program for rural schools." Pruitt mentioned it. Clara looked at him. "You've been talking to Pruitt about lending programs. He wired last week about the Henderson Boundary Survey." We got to talking. She studied him for a moment, that particular attention she sometimes turned on him, like she was checking a calculation she'd already done and finding it still accurate. She had the blueprints with her. She'd brought them from town in a leather tube, strapped to the saddlebag, the architectural drawings for the school's second room, which she was planning to add in the fall when she had enough enrolled students to require it. She pulled them out and spread them across her knees and looked at them. "I want to add a window on the north wall," she said, "for cross-ventilation in summer. The room gets hot." He leaned over and looked at the drawing. "You'd need to reinforce the header. The stud spacing there is already at maximum for that span. Can you do that? With Bishop's son helping?" "Yes." She made a note in the margin of the blueprint in her careful, clear handwriting. He watched her work. He'd been watching her work for 5 months now, which was long enough to know the rhythm of it. The focused, unself-conscious efficiency she brought to everything she decided to do. She didn't perform effort. She just applied it, steadily, to whatever was in front of her. She caught him looking. "What?" she said. "Nothing. You had a thought." "I was thinking about that first night," he said, "at the train station." She put the blueprints down. "You were terrified," he said. "You were running a fever. And you'd been hunted for 3 days, and you were sitting in a collapsing building, in a blizzard, and the first thing you said to me was nothing. You just watched me. I was calculating my options." "I know. That's what I was thinking about." He looked at the valley. Most people in that situation would have begged, or lied, or tried to charm their way out of it. Those weren't going to work on you. "How did you know your face?" she said simply. "You don't charm. You decide." There wasn't anything to appeal to, except your judgment. And I didn't know yet what your judgment was worth. She paused. "So I waited." He nodded slowly. She'd been right. Of course, she was right about most things, which he'd gotten used to over the winter. He wasn't a man who found being wrong easily. But he'd found that being wrong in front of Clara was different from being wrong in front of most people. She didn't store it, didn't use it later, just noted it and moved on. He appreciated that. It made him more willing to say things out loud instead of keeping them internal until they calcified. He picked up the blueprints and looked at the north wall notation. "If we put the window here," he said, touching the drawing, "you lose 1 desk space. The light overlap from the south windows won't reach that corner." "I know. I'm moving the desk arrangement." She pulled the blueprints back and made another mark. I want the reading area to the south and the arithmetic tables to the north. The light requirements are different. He looked at her profile the right side, which was the side facing him, fine-boned. Serious, the small line between her brows that appeared when she was working through something. Then she turned her head to look at the valley, and he saw the left side, the scar tissue running from her jaw to her temple, the neck where the damage had been worst. She'd stopped wearing the shawl in February, just stopped one day, and hadn't put it back on. Nobody in Oakhaven had commented on it. People who'd been through 12 years of Josiah Siathorn had a well-calibrated sense of what was worth remarking on and what wasn't. She was looking at the field below the cabin, the south-facing slope between the property and the main valley road. It had been dormant all winter, a gray-brown expanse of dried grass and old snow. It was green now in patches, and in the patches where the green was thickest, where the ground had warmed earliest, and the moisture from the snowmelt had settled just right. There were yellow heads beginning to push up through the soil, small still, barely open, but distinctly yellow against the early spring green. Wild sunflowers. They came up every year in this valley. Apparently, Miguel had mentioned it, in passing, in March. Said they were impossible to stop once they started. Said his kids used to run through them in July when they were at full height, arms out, knocking the seeds off. Clara was looking at them. He set down the blueprints and stood up. He walked down the porch steps and across the yard, and she came with him, tucking the blueprints under her arm, until they were standing at the edge of the field, looking at the beginning of the sunflowers. She crouched down and looked at one of the early heads, close up a tight yellow bud, still wrapped, about to open. She touched it very gently with one finger. He stood beside her. She straightened up, and without any particular ceremony or announcement, she turned toward him, and he put his arm around her waist and pulled her in. She came easily, which was its own kind of thing, the ease of it, the absence of the old flinching. 5 months of a man who kept his word had done something to the architecture of her trust. It hadn't replaced the history. Nothing replaces history. But it had built something alongside it. He put his hand on the side of her face, the left side. He brushed her hair back, gently, and kissed her where the scar was worst at the jaw, where it had started. She was still for a moment. Then she put her head against his shoulder. The good one, not the repaired one. She did this with the practical awareness of a woman who paid attention to things. They stood in the field at the edge of their property and looked at the valley below. The creek running, the smoke from chimneys, the Alvarez land, green and worked, and belonging again to the people who'd poured it. The town at the center of the valley, small from up here, going about the ordinary work of a spring morning, which was itself extraordinary, because 12 years of Josiah Thorne had made ordinary mornings anything but. The sunflowers would be at full height by July. She already knew this from Miguel's description, and could picture it, this whole slope covered in them, gold and tall, and facing the sun with the particular stubbornness of things that grow in difficult soil and don't apologize for it. She had a school to run and a second room to design, and 11 children who were, right now, sitting at 8 desks learning to read. She had testimony to give at 2 additional proceedings in Denver through the summer. She had blueprints in her arm and a note to write to the lending library, and a granddaughter of Ruth Hendricks who needed more advanced reading material before she outgrew the available curriculum. He had a corral to stock and a boundary survey to help the Hendersons finish, and 3 more families whose reclaimed land deeds needed a clear-eyed person to walk them through the practical next steps. He had a shoulder that was 90%, and a horse that deserved a name, and a habit of waking before dawn that he'd never quite been able to shake, and was starting to think maybe he didn't need to. The scars on her face were still there. They would always be there. Some things don't go away, and the honest approach to that fact is not to pretend otherwise, but to simply keep moving, keep building, keep putting one straight-walled room next to another until the structure is large enough to be worth living in. She'd said that once, in winter, When he'd asked her how she managed to keep going after everything, she'd said, "You build what you can with what you have. You don't wait until you have something better to start." He'd thought about that for weeks. The hawk that had been circling above the southern ridge banked and caught a thermal and rose, unhurried, until it was a small dark mark against the pale spring sky. And then it was gone. The sunflowers opened slowly in the morning sun. And so, when the last snow finally melted from the valley and the green returned beneath the dead winter grass, Clara's sterling victory was not measured by the sight of Josiah Thorne in chains. It was not measured by the 15 years he would spend behind prison walls, nor by the ashes of the church from which he had ruled an entire town through fear. Her true victory stood in a small schoolhouse filled with 11 children, its windows facing the sunlight and its walls built by hands that had once been separated by silence. That schoolhouse reminds us that justice is not complete when an evil man is punished. Justice becomes complete when what he destroyed is rebuilt, when stolen land is returned, when frightened neighbors learn to stand together, and when the next generation is taught how to recognize the chains that trapped their parents. Clara carried scars that Josiah intended to use as proof of his power over her. Instead, those scars became proof that he had failed. He burned her face, but he could not burn away her intelligence. He isolated her, but he could not silence her conscience. He called her dangerous, because powerful men have always feared the person who remembers, the person who keeps records, and the person who refuses to accept a lie simply because it is spoken from a pulpit or backed by a badge. Clara teaches us that courage is not always loud. Sometimes courage is a woman hiding papers beneath a stable floor. Sometimes it is holding a tin box against your chest while running through a blizzard. Sometimes it is standing before a town that once looked away and speaking every stolen name aloud. She was afraid many times, but fear did not decide her direction. Her purpose did. And perhaps that is the truest meaning of bravery, not the absence of fear, but the discovery of something more important than fear. Jace's journey gives us another lesson. When he first met Clara, he saw $500, a chance to settle a debt, and an escape from the life he had been scraping through. He was not immediately a hero. He hesitated. He calculated. He nearly allowed desperation to choose what kind of man he would become. But when the moment came, he burned the wanted poster and chose a human life over a reward. That choice did not erase his past, but it changed his future. Redemption does not begin when people claim they have changed. It begins when they are offered the same selfish road they once followed and choose another. Jace did not rescue Clara by taking control of her life. He stood beside her while she reclaimed control of her own. He listened when she spoke, trusted what she knew, followed her into danger, and remained when the fighting was over. That is what true love and loyalty look like, not possession, not grand promises, but respect, patience, shared burdens, and the quiet decision to stay. Sheriff Amos Vance reminds us that even a compromised man is not necessarily a lost man. For months, debt and fear had kept him obedient to Thorne. He had worn the badge while knowing that the law had been bent around him. Yet when his final choice arrived, Amos remembered what the badge was supposed to mean. He could not undo every day he had remained silent, but he could decide what he would do with the day in front of him. His sacrifice tells us that it is never too late to stop serving what is wrong. We may not be able to repair every mistake we have made, but we can refuse to make the next one. And sometimes, one honest decision made at great cost can open the road for justice to reach everyone else. The people of Oakhaven also carry an important warning. Joseph's power did not survive only because he was cruel. It survived because every family believed it was suffering alone. Fear separated neighbors who might have been strong together. Silence made his lies appear respectable. But when Clara opened the ledger and read their names aloud, those isolated victims became a community again. Evil often depends on convincing good people that resistance is useless and that nobody else will stand with them. The moment people begin telling the truth together, that illusion starts to break. In the end, the most meaningful object in this story is not Jake's gun, Clara's pistol, or even the ledger that convicted Josiah. It is the schoolhouse. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.